In the plains of Fars, in what is now southwestern Iran, approximately 60 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Shiraz, there is a terrace of stone. It rises approximately 12 meters above the surrounding plain, its base retaining walls built from massive limestone blocks fitted together with a precision that has withstood 2.5 millennia of seismic activity, weathering, and neglect. On top of the terrace are the remains of what was, for approximately 200 years, the most magnificent ceremonial center in the ancient world. The columns still stand, some of them. 13 of the original 72 columns of the Apadana, the great audience hall of the Persian kings, remain upright, their height of 20 meters giving the site the quality of a forest of stone, the shafts slender and perfectly proportioned, their capitals carrying the double-headed bull and eagle sculptures that are among the most distinctive achievements of the Achaemenid artistic tradition. The reliefs are still visible on the staircases, thousands of carved figures in the specific flat profile style of Achaemenid art, processions of tribute-bearers from every corner of the empire, rows of Persian and Median guards in their distinctive dress, delegations of foreign peoples bringing gifts whose specific identities have been painstakingly reconstructed by scholars who cross-referenced the carved images with the lists of subject peoples preserved in the texts of the Persepolis. Fortification Archive. The city was called Parsa in the Persian language, Persepolis in the Greek accounts that are the primary written sources for its history, a name meaning the city of Persia in the language of the civilization that destroyed it. It was built beginning under Darius the Great, who acceded to the throne of the Achaemenid Empire in 522 BCE and who initiated the construction of the terrace and its first buildings as a new ceremonial capital for an empire that at its maximum extent stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia and the borders of Greece in the west to the borders of India in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the cataracts of the Nile in the south. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire encompassed perhaps 40 to 50 million people and covered an area of approximately 5.5 million square kilometers, making it the largest empire the world had yet seen. The specific purpose of Persepolis within the Achaemenid imperial system was ceremonial rather than administrative. The administrative capital of the empire was at Susa, in the lowlands of what is now southwestern Iran, where the year-round temperatures were more moderate and where the flat plains facilitated the movement of people and goods that administrative activity required. Persepolis was visited by the court primarily in the spring, for the celebration of the Persian New Year, the Nowruz, which was the occasion for the reception of tribute delegations from across the empire whose processions are depicted on the staircases of the Apadana. The construction of Persepolis was therefore not the building of a city in the ordinary sense, but the creation of a stage for the ceremonial expression of imperial power, and every element of its architecture was designed to communicate the specific message that the Achaemenid kings wanted the world to receive about the nature of their authority and the extent of their dominion. For 200 years, from Darius to the last Achaemenid king Darius III, Persepolis was the symbolic heart of the largest empire in the history of the world. And then, in 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon marched his army through the pass called the Persian Gates, defeated the defenders, entered Persepolis, and set fire to the palaces. The fire burned through the night. By morning, the greatest ceremonial complex in the ancient world was a ruin. The specific quality of what survives at Persepolis communicates something about the fire that no description fully captures. The calcination of the limestone columns, produced by the intense heat of the burning timbers, turned the stone gray and left it permanently weakened, so that what was once polished and gleaming is now matte and crumbling at the surface. The floor-level deposits, examined in excavation, showed the fused metals and the carbonized organic materials that the fire left behind, the charred cedar beams that had supported the roof, the melted bronze fittings of the doors and furniture, the traces of the textiles and wooden furnishings that burned completely and left only chemical signatures in the soil. The fire is still physically present at Persepolis, written into the material of the ruins in ways that no amount of subsequent time has erased. The experience of Persepolis at different times of day and in different seasons reveals dimensions of the site that a single visit cannot capture. The summer heat on the Fars Plateau can be extreme, and the ancient Persians who built the ceremonial complex and who visited it for the spring ceremonies of the Nowruz experienced the site at a very specific and very particular time of year, when the wildflowers of the plateau would have been in bloom and the temperatures were moderate. The winter visitor encounters a site under frost, with the snow-capped mountains of the Zagros visible to the north and east and the stone of the terrace cold and gray in the flat winter light. The spring visitor, arriving at the season for which Persepolis was designed, encounters a landscape that is briefly green before the summer heat burns it to brown, and the light on the carved reliefs in the spring morning has a clarity that no other season matches. The Achaemenid Empire that built Persepolis was not the despotic Oriental tyranny that the Greek literary tradition portrayed, but one of the most sophisticated and most genuinely cosmopolitan political systems the ancient world produced. And understanding it requires setting aside the caricature that Greek literature established and that the burning of Persepolis by Alexander has done much to perpetuate. The Achaemenid kings, beginning with Cyrus the Great who founded the dynasty in 550 BCE, were distinguished from other ancient rulers of comparable power by a specific attitude toward the peoples they conquered that was unlike anything that had preceded it in the ancient Near East. Where the Assyrian Empire, whose sphere the Achaemenids replaced, had systematically destroyed the cultures and deportated the populations of conquered peoples as instruments of imperial control, Cyrus and his successors adopted a policy of cultural toleration that allowed subject peoples to maintain their religions, their languages, their legal systems, and their cultural practices within the framework of Achaemenid imperial administration. The specific expression of this policy was the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform that records Cyrus's capture of Babylon in 539 BCE and his restoration of the religious practices and the sacred statues of the Babylonian deities that the previous king Nabonidus had neglected. The cylinder records Cyrus presenting himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator, a restorer of the proper order of things, chosen by the Babylonian god Marduk to rescue the Babylonians from the misrule of their own king. This rhetorical strategy, of presenting imperial conquest as cultural restoration, was a distinctive feature of Achaemenid imperial ideology that distinguished the Persian Empire from its predecessors and that made the conquest of the Near East by the Persians less traumatic for many subject populations than the conquests of the Assyrians had been. The practical expressions of Achaemenid tolerance were concrete and consequential. The Jews who had been deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar were permitted by Cyrus to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, an act that made Cyrus a figure of special reverence in the Hebrew Bible, where the second Isaiah calls him the Anointed of the Lord. The Egyptians were treated as a separate kingdom within the empire, with Cambyses, Cyrus's son, adopting Egyptian royal titulature and presenting himself as a legitimate pharaoh rather than a foreign conqueror. The Greeks of the Ionian cities on the coast of Anatolia, incorporated into the empire by Cyrus, were administered through local tyrants who operated within the Persian imperial system but maintained the institutions of their own cities. The administrative system that held this enormous and culturally diverse empire together was organized around the concept of the satrapy, a provincial unit governed by a satrap who was typically a Persian noble but who administered his satrapy in a way that respected local customs and legal traditions while ensuring the collection of tribute and the maintenance of imperial authority. The satrapies were connected by the royal road, a network of paved highways maintained by the imperial government, along which a royal courier service operated that could carry a message from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in approximately 7 days, a speed of communication that would not be equaled in the region for 2,000 years. The specific genius of the Achaemenid imperial system, as visible in the administrative evidence of the fortification archive and in the architectural statement of Persepolis, was the recognition that a diverse empire required a governance framework that could accommodate diversity without imposing uniformity. The administrative language of the empire's western provinces was Aramaic, not Persian. The law applied in Egypt was Egyptian law, The religious ceremonies supported by the imperial treasury included Babylonian temple rituals and Jewish religious observances as well as Zoroastrian practices. This deliberate pluralism was not simply pragmatic accommodation to the impossibility of forcing uniformity across such a vast territory, but was a genuine philosophical position about the proper relationship between imperial authority and cultural diversity, expressed in the royal inscriptions in terms of the Achaemenid king's special relationship with Ahura Mazda and his responsibility to maintain the good order of a world that the supreme deity had made diverse. The specific royal road that connected the western and eastern portions of the Achaemenid Empire was one of the most significant pieces of infrastructure in the ancient world, not merely for the speed of communication that it made possible, but for the specific character of the governance it enabled. The road was paved and maintained, its route marked by milestones, its relay stations provisioned and staffed, and its use regulated by the imperial administration, whose records included the documentation of officials and goods moving along it. The fortification archive includes tablets that record the rations provided at specific stations along the roads of the imperial heartland to travelers and officials moving on imperial business, providing a ground-level view of the operation of the road system that complements the more general descriptions of the royal road preserved in the Greek historians. The architecture of Persepolis is the most direct expression available of the specific vision of imperial authority that the Achaemenid kings were projecting, and the specific choices made in its design, the scale of the buildings, the organization of the spaces, and above all the iconographic program of the carved reliefs, are a text whose content the civilization's own words can help to interpret. The terrace on which Persepolis was built was an artificial platform constructed over the natural rock of the hillside, extending and regularizing the natural topography to create a level surface of approximately 125,000 square meters on which the principal buildings were arranged. The construction of the terrace itself, which required the movement of enormous quantities of stone and the leveling of an irregular hillside over a period of decades, was one of the major engineering achievements of the ancient world. Access to the terrace was by a double staircase whose shallow treads were designed to allow horses and large delegations to ascend with ease, a deliberate architectural statement that the approach to the king's presence was effortless and welcoming rather than demanding. The Apodana, the great audience hall begun by Darius and completed by his son Xerxes, was the largest and most important building on the terrace, a hypostyle hall whose roof was supported by 72 columns standing 20 meters high, each topped by the distinctive Achaemenid capital of two back-to-back animal protomes, typically bulls or lions or eagles whose combined bodies served as the bracket for the roof beams above. The hall itself measured approximately 60 meters on each side and could accommodate, according to the estimates of scholars who have studied the architecture in detail, thousands of people for the ceremonial audiences that were the primary function of the building. Surrounding the hall on three sides were porticos whose columns continued the forest effect of the hall's interior into the open air of the terrace, creating a monumental outdoor space that complemented the enclosed ceremony space of the hall itself. The Gate of All Nations, one of the first buildings encountered by visitors ascending to the terrace, communicated the central political claim of the Achaemenid imperial system in its name and its architecture. All nations came to Persepolis, and all nations passed through this gate. The name was a statement about the universality of Achaemenid authority and about the specific form of that authority, which was not the exclusion of other peoples but their welcome into the ordered world of the Persian king. The colossal bulls that flanked its doorways, their scale designed to dwarf the human beings who passed between them, communicated the superhuman power behind the king's welcome, and the inscriptions in three languages that identified the builder and the builder's god transformed the gate into a multilingual statement about the specific nature of the empire. The staircases of the Apodana carry the most extensively documented iconographic program of the entire site, the famous procession reliefs that show on one face the tribute bearers of 23 different subject peoples of the empire approaching the king's presence, each delegation identified by its distinctive costume, its tribute gifts, and its specific place in the line, and on another face the guards and nobles of the Achaemenid court in their own procession. The identification of the tribute-bearing peoples with the lists of subject populations preserved in the royal inscriptions and in the administrative documents of the archive has allowed scholars to reconstruct the specific geographic extent of the empire that Persepolis was designed to symbolize and to understand the specific political logic of including representatives of so many different peoples in the visual program of the most important building in the ceremonial capital. The specific sequence of architectural spaces through which a visitor to Persepolis moved, from the approach across the plain to the ascent of the staircase to the passage through the gate of all nations to the experience of the Apodana, was designed as a carefully calibrated progression of revelations, each space preparing the visitor for the next and each transition marked by an architectural threshold that communicated the transition from one domain to another. The shallow treads of the staircase were designed not just for ease of ascent, but to slow the ascent into a measured processional movement, to impose a pace of approach that gave the ascending visitor time to absorb the carved program of the staircase balustrades and to arrive at the top already prepared for the specific register of experience that the terrace required. This deliberate choreography of approach and arrival is one of the most sophisticated achievements of the Persepolis architectural design. The specific relationship between the Persepolis terrace and the natural landscape in which it is set is one of the more frequently overlooked aspects of the site's design. The choice of the specific location, on a natural rock outcrop at the base of the Ku-i-Rahmath mountain and overlooking a wide plain, was not determined purely by practical considerations but by the specific qualities of the landscape that the location offered. The backdrop of the mountain gave the terrace a monumental context that amplified its visual scale, and the view from the terrace across the plain communicated the same geographic claim that the tribute procession reliefs expressed in stone, the claim that the entire visible world was under the king's protection and governance. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, one of the most important bodies of administrative documentation from the ancient world, provides a direct and extraordinarily detailed window into the functioning of the Achaemenid imperial administration during the critical period of the early construction of Persepolis, from approximately 509 to 494 BCE. The archive consists of approximately 30,000 clay tablets and fragments inscribed primarily in Elamite, the administrative language of the imperial bureaucracy, with smaller numbers of tablets in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the western parts of the empire. The tablets record the movement of commodities through the imperial supply system, specifically the rations of grain, wine, beer, meat, and livestock paid to workers, officials, and travelers moving through the administrative zone centered on Persepolis. Each tablet records specific transactions: the name of the recipient, the commodity provided, the quantity, the occasion for the transaction, the administrative official responsible, and the date. The picture of the Achaemenid administrative system that emerges from the tablets is remarkable for its bureaucratic sophistication and for the scale of the operations it was managing. The supply system documented by the tablets supported thousands of workers at the construction sites of Persepolis itself, as well as the movement of goods and people across the road network of the empire. The specific categories of people receiving rations include workers from many different parts of the empire, including contingents identified as Egyptians, Carians, Lydians, and various other peoples of the Western Empire who were working at Persepolis not as slaves, but as skilled laborers receiving compensation in the form of food and wine according to their specific skill level and status. The tablets also document the role of women in the Achaemenid administrative system in ways that have significantly revised previous understandings of the position of women in the ancient Persian world. Women workers receive rations from the system, and in some cases women are listed as supervisors of work gangs and as recipients of rations at higher rates that correspond to supervisory rather than laboring status. Women who were pregnant or who had recently given birth received additional rations, and women traveling on official business received rations and accommodation along the road network just as male officials did. The picture of the Achaemenid world that the tablets paint is considerably more complex and more egalitarian in some respects than the Greek literary tradition's portrayal of a despotic Oriental kingdom would suggest. The archive was discovered in 1933 during excavations at Persepolis by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and approximately 30,000 tablets were eventually removed to Chicago for study, where they remain to this day. The specific legal and political status of the tablets, which are the property of the Iranian government but have been held in the United States for more than 80 years under a complex arrangement that has been affected by the political relationship between the two countries, has made them the subject of an ongoing dispute that reflects the broader politics of cultural heritage and the relationship between the contemporary world and the material legacies of the ancient one. The fortification archive is also extraordinary for the specific window it provides into the lives of women in the Achaemenid world. The tablets document women workers, women supervisors, and women travelers on imperial business, and they record the specific rations provided to pregnant women and new mothers within the workforce. This is not the picture of a civilization in which women were confined to domestic spaces with no role in the public economy. The Achaemenid administrative system employed women at multiple levels and provided for their specific needs in ways that the administrative record preserves in unusual detail. The contrast with the Greek literary tradition's portrayal of the Persian world as a place of oriental despotism and female seclusion is as striking as the contrast between the Greek portrayal of Persian religion and the actual character of Zoroastrian ethics as documented in the Persian texts. The specific language used in the fortification archive tablets, the administrative Elamite that was the bureaucratic language of the Achaemenid imperial system in its homeland, is itself one of the more remarkable aspects of the archive. Elamite was not the native language of the Persian ruling class, whose own language is represented in the royal inscriptions of Persepolis, nor was it the lingua franca of the empire's western regions, where Aramaic served that function. It was instead the inherited administrative language of the pre-Achaemenid chancellery tradition of southwestern Iran, and its continued use by the Persian administration reflects the pragmatic conservatism of a bureaucratic system that preserved effective tools rather than replacing them with politically preferred alternatives. This pragmatism is itself characteristic of the Achaemenid approach to administration more broadly. The Apadana reliefs, which show the tribute-bearing peoples of the Achaemenid Empire in their distinctive costumes and with their characteristic gifts, are among the most important documents for the understanding of the specific character of the empire and of the political ideology that Persepolis was built to express. The relief program of the Apadana staircases was designed to be read as a coherent statement about the nature of Achaemenid imperial authority and the relationship between the king and the peoples he governed. The 23 delegations approaching the king's presence represent not the conquered peoples of an empire built by force, but the chosen representatives of a world order in which diverse peoples voluntarily offered their tribute and their loyalty to a king whose authority derived from the favor of Ahura Mazda, the great god of the Zoroastrian tradition, and whose wise governance expressed that divine favor in the prosperity and order of the world under his rule. This is the specific political theology of the Achaemenid Empire, expressed in stone, and the specific choices about which peoples to include, how to depict them, and in what order to place them in the procession are deliberate statements about the nature of that imperial order. The individual delegations are distinguished from each other by their costumes, their hairstyles, their specific tribute gifts, and by the animals that some of them are leading. The Median delegation, closest to the Persian in the procession, wears the distinctive Median dress of round hat and belted coat that is recognizable from other ancient sources. The Lydians, from what is now western Turkey, bring metal vessels and other products of the metalworking tradition for which Lydia was famous. The Ethiopians bring elephant tusks and a giraffe. The Indians bring a donkey and vessels of gold. The delegation from the region of the Persian Gulf brings textiles and a bull. Each detail is specific. Each gift is authentic to the economic and ecological character of the region it represents, and the cumulative effect of the 23 delegations is a visual encyclopedia of the ancient world's geographic and cultural diversity as seen from the center of the Achaemenid Empire. The specific artistic style of the Apadana reliefs, which uses a consistent flat profile convention to depict all figures regardless of their cultural origin, integrates the diversity of the empire's subject peoples into a single visual vocabulary that simultaneously acknowledges their distinctiveness and places them within the unified order of the Achaemenid world. This integration is itself a statement about the nature of Achaemenid imperial authority. Not the flattening of difference that characterizes some imperial traditions, but the organization of difference within a framework that gives each people its specific place and its specific dignity within the larger whole. The specific medium of the Apadana reliefs, carved limestone that was originally painted in polychrome, gave the iconographic program a visual richness that the monochrome stone preserves only as shadows of its original intensity. The traces of pigment that survive on protected areas of the relief surfaces, including the blue paint of the lotus border and the red and white of some costume details, give an indication of the colorful visual environment that the Apadana presented to the delegations who approached it at the height of the Nowruz ceremonies. The specific visual experience of a polychrome relief program of this scale, covering hundreds of meters of staircase walls in a procession of painted figures representing the full geographic and cultural extent of the known world, would have been unlike anything that visitors from the empire's periphery had ever encountered, and its effect as a statement of imperial power would have been enhanced by the specific sensory experience of encountering it. The specific procession depicted on the Apadana staircases was not merely decorative, but was a representation of the actual Nowruz ceremony in which delegations from across the empire presented their tribute to the king in the spring of each year. The physical processions that ascended the stairs and entered the Apadana at the time of the Nowruz were thus moving through a carved representation of themselves, the actual tribute-bearers walking alongside or in front of the carved tribute-bearers who preceded them in stone. This specific doubling of the real and the represented is one of the most sophisticated elements of the Persepolis iconographic program, a deliberate architectural statement that the specific ceremony taking place here had been taking place since the beginning of the empire and would continue taking place for as long as the empire endured. The carved procession was the idealized and permanent form of the real procession, and the real procession gave the carved procession its living meaning. The Persian kings who built Persepolis were practitioners of a religious tradition that profoundly shaped the empire's ideology and its administrative practice, and understanding the role of Zoroastrianism in the Achaemenid world is essential for understanding the specific character of the civilization that Persepolis expressed. Zoroastrianism, the religion whose prophet Zarathustra or Zoroaster is estimated by scholars to have lived somewhere between 1500 and 600 BCE, is one of the world's oldest monotheistic religious traditions and one whose influence on the subsequent development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam has been profound and underappreciated. The central theological proposition of Zoroastrianism is the cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord and the principle of truth and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit and the principle of falsehood and darkness. Human beings are participants in this cosmic struggle, called to choose the side of truth and to contribute to the ultimate victory of light over darkness through their choices and their actions. The Achaemenid kings presented themselves as the champions of Ahura Mazda in this cosmic struggle and their empire as the instrument of divine order in the world. The royal inscriptions, of which the most extensive are the great texts of Darius at Behistun and at Persepolis itself, repeatedly invoke Ahura Mazda as the source of the king's authority and portray the empire as the embodiment of the divine order of truth against the chaos of falsehood. The famous phrase of the Behistun inscription, which declares that whoever follows the truth shall be happy and whomever is a liar shall be destroyed, expresses the moral framework within which the Achaemenid kings understood their imperial project. The specific religious practices of Persepolis are partially recoverable from the fortification archive, which records rations provided for religious ceremonies and for the maintenance of sacred fires at various points in the administrative system. The Zoroastrian tradition places great emphasis on fire as the visible symbol of truth and divine purity, and the maintenance of sacred fires by the priestly class, the Magi, was one of the central religious obligations of the Achaemenid state. Whether the main fire temples of the Achaemenid religious system were located at Persepolis itself or at other sites in the Persian heartland is a question that the architectural and textual evidence has not definitively resolved. but the religious dimension of Persepolis as a place where the king presented himself before the divine and before his subjects is clear from both the architecture and the inscriptions. The relationship between Zoroastrian theology and the Achaemenid policy of religious toleration towards subject peoples is one of the more interesting aspects of the empire's religious history. The Zoroastrian cosmology, with its strong dualistic framework of truth against falsehood, might seem to militate against the toleration of the religious traditions of subject peoples, many of whom worship deities that a strict Zoroastrian theology would categorize as the manifestations of the forces of darkness. But the practical religious policy of the Achaemenid kings, which was one of remarkable tolerance, suggests that the cosmological framework was applied selectively and pragmatically in the context of imperial administration. The specific question of how Zoroastrian religious practice was organized at Persepolis is one that the Fortification Archive addresses only obliquely, through the records of rations provided for religious ceremonies and for the maintenance of sacred fires. The tablets record the provision of wine, grain, and other commodities for what appear to be ceremonial purposes at various locations in the administrative system, and some of these records can be connected with the known practices of the Zoroastrian religion as documented in the later texts of the tradition. The specific identity of the religious personnel who conducted these ceremonies, whether they were magi in the technical sense of the priestly specialists of the Zoroastrian tradition or a broader category of religious functionaries, is debated, but the existence of a formal ceremonial calendar integrated into the administrative system is clearly documented. The specific royal inscriptions at Persepolis, which are among the most extensive direct expressions of the Achaemenid royal voice that have survived, present the king as the instrument of divine justice in a world where truth must prevail over falsehood and order must prevail over chaos. The Diva inscription of Xerxes, which records the destruction of a temple of the Diva, the demonized gods of the Zoroastrian tradition, at an unspecified location in the empire, is the most direct evidence for an occasion when the Achaemenid religious policy crossed the line from toleration to active suppression. But the inscription also reveals the exceptional character of this act. Xerxes presents his action against the Diva as extraordinary, requiring explanation and justification, rather than as the normal practice of imperial religious policy. The Zoroastrian cosmology, with its strong dualistic framework of truth against falsehood, might seem to militate against the toleration of the religious traditions of subject peoples, many of whom worship deities that a strict Zoroastrian theology would categorize as the manifestations of the forces of darkness. But the practical religious policy of the Achaemenid kings, which as we have seen was one of remarkable tolerance, suggests that the cosmological framework was applied selectively and pragmatically in the context of imperial administration. The Persian wars of the early 5th century BCE, whose climactic battles at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea have been celebrated in Western historical tradition as the defense of Greek freedom against Eastern tyranny, were experienced on the Persian side in a fundamentally different way that the architecture and inscriptions of Persepolis help to illuminate. Darius the Great, the king who initiated the construction of Persepolis and who launched the first Persian invasion of mainland Greece in 492 BCE, was responding to Greek intervention in the affairs of the empire's western provinces. The Ionian Revolt of 499 to 494 BCE, in which the Greek cities of the Ionian coast of Anatolia rebelled against their Persian governors and were supported by Athens and Eretria, was from the Persian perspective a rebellion of subject peoples aided by foreign interference, and the subsequent Persian expeditions to Greece were punitive campaigns against states that had supported rebellion rather than campaigns of conquest against a free civilization. The specific Persian experience of the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, where the Athenian forces defeated the Persian landing army and forced its withdrawal, has left no direct Persian literary record, because the Achaemenid Empire did not produce the tradition of narrative history that the Greeks developed, and the administrative records do not speak to the strategic decisions of the high command. The Persian wars appear in the inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes primarily as elements of the larger narrative of divine order and royal justice, with the rebellious subjects of the empire cast in the role of followers of falsehood and the king's campaigns against them as the restoration of truth and order rather than as military operations with specific tactical and strategic dimensions. Xerxes, whose invasion of mainland Greece in 480 BCE included the famous battles of Thermopylae and Salamis and who burned the Acropolis of Athens, subsequently completed the construction of Persepolis and added several of its most important buildings, including the Throne Hall and the Gate of All Nations. The building of Persepolis and the invasion of Greece were simultaneous projects of the same imperial administration, funded by the same tribute system and staffed by the same bureaucratic apparatus, and the juxtaposition of the magnificent constructive achievement of Persepolis with the military campaign that ended in the Greek victory at Plataea is one of the more dramatic ironies of the period. The empire that burned Athens built Persepolis. The civilization that burned Persepolis claimed to be the heir of Athens. The specific irony of the relationship between Persepolis and the Greek tradition deepens when one considers the architectural connections between the two civilizations. The Achaemenid artistic tradition that produced the reliefs of Persepolis drew on Greek sculptors and craftsmen from the Ionian cities of the Western Empire, and the specific stylistic elements of the Persepolis reliefs that appear most distinctively Persian, including the specific conventions of drapery representation and the specific proportions of the human figure, show the influence of the Greek artistic tradition on the workshops that produced them. The two civilizations that fought each other at Marathon and Salamis and Plataea were at the same time exchanging artists, craftsmen, and intellectual traditions across the political boundaries of the conflict, and Persepolis is in part a product of this exchange. The fire that destroyed it was therefore also the destruction of something that Greek artistry had helped to build. The specific inscription that Xerxes placed in the Hades, his own palace at Persepolis, contains a striking declaration of the moral framework within which he understood his imperial project. A man who follows the truth, who does what is right, who does not lie, shall be happy. The same king who burned the Acropolis of Athens and who whipped the Hellespont when a storm destroyed his bridge of boats erected this declaration of truth and justice in the ceremonial heart of his empire, and the juxtaposition, while jarring to modern sensibilities, accurately reflects the specific moral framework within which the Achaemenid kings understood their actions. The Greek literary tradition that portrayed the Persian Wars as a conflict between freedom and tyranny was itself a product of the specific political situation of the Greek city-states in the 5th century BCE, and its rhetorical power should not obscure the more complex realities of the conflict as experienced on both sides. The Persian Empire included among its subjects Greek populations of the Ionian cities who lived under Persian rule without apparent difficulty for the better part of 2 centuries, and the Persian administration of these cities was not, in most periods, significantly more oppressive than the administration of any other comparable city-state system of the time. The Ionian revolt that triggered the Persian Wars was not a spontaneous uprising of a freedom-loving people against tyranny, but a complex political event driven by specific local grievances and opportunistic politics in which the distinction between freedom and submission to authority was considerably more nuanced than the subsequent Greek narrative suggested. The administrative city that supported the ceremonial complex of Persepolis, whose existence is documented by the fortification archive but whose physical remains are far less well preserved than the monumental terrace, represents a dimension of the site that has received less archaeological attention, but that is equally important for the understanding of how Persepolis actually functioned. The terrace visible today was only the most visible element of a much larger complex that included the lower city below the terrace, whose residential and administrative buildings housed the thousands of workers, officials, priests, and attendants who made the ceremonial activities of the terrace possible. The evidence for the lower city, which has been partially revealed by excavation but whose full extent and character are not yet established, includes the remains of administrative buildings, storage facilities, and the quarters of the workmen whose activities are documented in the fortification archive. The specific spatial relationship between the terrace and the lower city, and the specific organization of the flows of people and goods between the two, are questions that future excavation will address but that the existing evidence does not yet resolve. The treasury of Persepolis, whose remains occupy a large area in the southeastern corner of the terrace, was the storage facility for the tribute received from across the empire and for the movable wealth that the Achaemenid kings accumulated over generations. When Alexander captured Persepolis, his army found in the treasury a quantity of precious metal that contemporary sources describe as amounting to several thousand tons of silver and gold, an accumulation of wealth on a scale that astonished even the soldiers of a Macedonian army that had already conquered Egypt and Mesopotamia. The specific inventories of the treasury are not preserved in any text, and the estimate of its contents from the literary sources must be treated with caution, but the architectural scale of the treasury buildings and their location within the terrace plan confirm that they were designed to store very large quantities of valuable goods. The physical reality of life at Persepolis for the thousands of workers documented in the archive involved the specific conditions of a large construction project at altitude in a region with hot summers and cold winters, conditions that the archive documents through the rations provided for different seasons and different categories of worker. The tablets record workers receiving higher rations of wine and meat in winter months and lower rations in summer, reflecting the nutritional demands of working in cold weather. They record the additional rations provided to workers who were performing particularly demanding tasks. They record the system of supervision that ensured the efficiency of the workforce and the accountability of the officials responsible for its management. The specific character of the Persepolis Fortification Archive as a source for the social history of the Achaemenid Empire has been transformed by the application of digital methods to the corpus of tablets. The creation of a searchable electronic database of all the tablet texts has allowed the statistical analysis of the distribution of rations across different categories of workers, the tracking of specific individuals through multiple tablets, and the reconstruction of the administrative structures that organize the workforce documented by the tablets. These analyses have revealed patterns in the distribution of labor and resources that would not have been visible to individual scholars examining the tablets one by one, and they have produced new interpretations of the administrative geography and the social organization of the imperial heartland during the critical decades of the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE. The specific archaeology of the lower city of Persepolis, which has been less extensively investigated than the monumental terrace, has revealed traces of the residential and administrative areas that housed the thousands of workers whose daily presence made the ceremonial activities of the terrace possible. The remains of storage facilities, cooking areas, and the specific material culture of daily life, including pottery, tools, and personal ornaments, give a more grounded picture of the human reality behind the monumental architecture of the terrace. The people who built and maintained Persepolis were not abstractions in a royal ideology but specific individuals with specific daily needs for food, shelter, and human community, and the administrative archive that recorded their rations and their movements gives them a degree of individuality that the monumental art of the terrace, focused entirely on the king and the order he maintained, does not. They record the additional rations provided to workers who were performing particularly demanding tasks. They record the system of supervision that ensured the efficiency of the workforce and the accountability of the officials responsible for its management. The burning of Persepolis by Alexander in 330 BCE is one of the most famous acts of destruction in the ancient world, and the specific circumstances of the fire, the motivations attributed to Alexander by the ancient sources, and the long debate about whether the fire was deliberate policy or drunken accident, are questions that the surviving evidence illuminates but does not definitively resolve. Alexander reached Persepolis in January 330 BCE after defeating the Persian garrison at the Persian Gates, a narrow mountain pass through which the road to Persepolis ran. The delay imposed by the Persian defense of the gates had allowed the city's population to evacuate, but the treasury with its enormous accumulation of precious metal remained, and Alexander's forces found there the wealth that his Greek and Macedonian soldiers had been fighting toward since the campaign began. The city was not immediately burned. Alexander and his army spent approximately 4 months at Persepolis, during which Alexander used the city as a base for military operations in the surrounding region and took systematic measures to secure the treasury and to manage the removal of its contents. The ancient sources differ on the specific circumstances of the fire. Arrian, whose account is the most carefully historical of the surviving sources, says simply that Alexander set fire to the Persian palace against the advice of Parmenion, who argued that it was foolish to destroy property that was now Alexander's own. Diodorus and Plutarch add a more colorful detail, that the fire was set at the suggestion of the Athenian courtesan Thais, who proposed it at a drinking party as an act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier, and that Alexander, drunk and swept along by the enthusiasm of the company, led the torchbearers himself. The party story may be elaboration or legend, but even Arrian acknowledges that the burning was controversial at the time and that Alexander later expressed regret for it. The scholarly debate about the burning has centered on the question of whether it was a deliberate political act, a calculated statement that Alexander was the avenger of the Greeks and the destroyer of the Persian imperial system, or a spontaneous act that was subsequently rationalized. The political interpretation holds that Alexander needed to signal to the Greeks that his campaign had achieved its stated objective of punishing Persia for the invasion of 480 BCE, and that burning Persepolis was the most dramatic way of making that statement. The spontaneous interpretation holds that the accounts of Diodorus and Plutarch preserve a genuine memory of how the fire actually started, as an act of drunken bravado that Alexander later regretted. What is not in dispute is the physical result. The wooden roof structures of the main buildings of Persepolis, which had remained largely intact for 150 years, burned in a fire whose intensity was sufficient to collapse the upper portions of the buildings and to calcine the limestone of the columns and walls, permanently damaging the stone that the Achaemenid masons had carved and polished. The specific aftermath of the burning at Persepolis is documented both in the ancient sources and in the archaeological record. Alexander's forces spent several months at Persepolis after the fire, using the site as a base for military operations, and the evidence from the ruins suggests that some parts of the complex continued to be used for administrative purposes even after the main buildings had burned. The treasury, whose mud brick walls partially collapsed in the fire, was apparently used for some time after the burning, and the tablets found in the treasury deposits, which date from after the fire, suggest that the administrative functions of the complex did not immediately cease with the destruction of the ceremonial buildings. The transition from Achaemenid to Macedonian control of the site was gradual rather than instantaneous, a process of administrative continuity within the context of political rupture, permanently damaging the stone that the Achaemenid masons had carved and polished. The mud brick walls of the treasury, unable to withstand the heat of the burning timber, partially collapsed. The gold and silver objects that had not been removed burned and melted in the intense heat, some of them fusing to the floors on which they were stored. The greatest concentration of movable wealth in the ancient world was destroyed in a single night. The specific question of what Alexander intended to achieve by burning Persepolis, and whether the fire achieved its intended effect, is one that the ancient sources do not directly answer. The political interpretation, that the burning was a deliberate signal to the Greeks that the Persian wars had been avenged, presupposes an audience in Greece that would receive and understand the signal, but the practical mechanisms by which news of the burning would reach that audience and the specific political consequences that the signal was intended to produce are not spelled out in any source. The alternative interpretation, that the burning was spontaneous and its political significance largely retrospective, is consistent with the accounts of Diodorus and Plutarch but cannot be reconciled with the careful strategic thinking that Alexander displayed in other contexts. The ambiguity of the evidence is likely a true reflection of the ambiguity of Alexander's own intentions at the moment of the burning. The legacy of the Achaemenid Empire in the cultures that succeeded it is one of the most significant and most underappreciated dimensions of ancient world history, and understanding it requires recognizing both the direct influences that the Persian imperial system exercised on the Greek, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman worlds that followed it and the longer-term influences that Persian religious and cultural traditions exercised on the development of the Abrahamic religions. The immediate legacy of the Achaemenid Empire for Alexander's successors was the specific model of imperial administration that the Persians had developed over 2 centuries. When Alexander died in 323 BCE and his empire was divided among his generals, the Diadochi who succeeded him found themselves governing territories whose administrative traditions were deeply Persian, whose populations had been organized under the satrapial system for 2 centuries, and whose political expectations were shaped by the Achaemenid model of a cosmopolitan empire that tolerated religious and cultural diversity while maintaining central control over tribute and military service. The Seleucid dynasty that inherited the eastern portions of Alexander's empire and that ruled from Mesopotamia for more than a century after his death adopted many elements of the Achaemenid administrative system and presented itself as the continuation of the Persian imperial tradition rather than as its replacement. The influence of Achaemenid architecture on the subsequent artistic traditions of the region is visible in the specific artistic conventions that spread across the Near East and Central Asia in the Hellenistic period, including the specific conventions of relief carving that were developed at Persepolis and that influenced the artistic traditions of Parthian Persia and eventually of Sasanian Persia, the successor empire that ruled Iran from the 3rd to the 7th century CE. The Sasanians explicitly claimed to be the restorers of the Achaemenid tradition, and their monumental rock reliefs at Naksh-e-Rostam, a site adjacent to Persepolis where the Achaemenid royal tombs were carved into the cliff face, consciously responded to the Achaemenid models visible at the same location. The specific intellectual encounter between Greek and Persian thought that the Achaemenid period facilitated, as Greek thinkers who traveled to Persia and Persian-educated scholars who moved in Greek intellectual circles exchanged ideas across the political boundaries of the 2 civilizations, is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of ancient intellectual history. The Persian court was known to Greek intellectuals as a center of learning and of philosophical discussion, and figures like Heraclitus are believed to have had contact with Persian religious thought. The specific similarities between Zoroastrian cosmological concepts and the philosophical frameworks of Heraclitus and the Stoics have long been noted by scholars, though the specific mechanisms of transmission remain debated. The influence of Zoroastrian religious concepts on the development of the Abrahamic religions is one of the most debated questions in the comparative study of religion, but most scholars who specialize in the relevant traditions agree that the period of the Babylonian exile, when the Jewish people lived under Babylonian and then Persian rule, was a period of significant religious development in which ideas about cosmic dualism, apocalyptic history, individual judgment after death, and the role of a messianic figure in the final restoration of divine order all appear or develop significantly in the Jewish tradition. These ideas, which are the defining characteristics of the Zoroastrian theological system, appear in precisely the period when the Jewish elite was in close contact with the Persian imperial system, and the specific mechanism of their transfer, whether through direct contact with Zoroastrian teachings or through the broader intellectual environment of the Achaemenid world, is a question that continues to engage scholars. The material legacy of the Achaemenid Empire in the specific artistic and architectural traditions of the successor cultures is one of the more concrete dimensions of its influence. The specific conventions of Achaemenid court art, including the particular style of relief carving, the specific animal and hybrid creature iconography, and the distinctive architectural forms of the hypostyle hall and the high terrace, appear in modified forms in the art and architecture of the Parthian and Sasanian periods and persist in Iranian artistic tradition into the Islamic period and beyond. The specific visual vocabulary that Persepolis helped to create was not destroyed by the fire of 330 BCE, but was absorbed into the artistic traditions of the succeeding cultures and transformed by them into something new that nonetheless preserved the specific qualities of the original. The ruins of Persepolis are thus not only a monument to the Achaemenid Empire, but a source for all the artistic traditions that it fed into. The modern rediscovery and archaeological investigation of Persepolis, which began with the visits of European travelers in the 17th century and became systematic with the excavations of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in the 1930s, is a story that reflects both the intellectual history of the study of the ancient Near East and the specific political context of Iran in the 20th century. The ruins of Persepolis were not unknown to the inhabitants of the region in the medieval period. Islamic scholars and travelers described them and speculated about their origin, and the ruins appear in the accounts of medieval Persian poets who found in the collapsed columns and fallen reliefs a powerful image of the transience of worldly power. The specific identification of the ruins as the palace of the Persian kings was made by European travelers beginning in the 16th century, and by the 18th century Persepolis was well known to European scholars as one of the most impressive surviving monuments of the ancient world. The systematic archaeological investigation of the site began in 1931, when Ernst Herzfeld of the Oriental Institute began excavations that continued under the direction of Erich Schmidt until 1939. The Oriental Institute excavations uncovered the major buildings of the terrace, cleared the relief sculptures of the accumulated debris of centuries, discovered the fortification archive, and produced the foundational scholarly publications that remain essential references for the study of the site. The methods of the excavations, which were state-of-the-art for the 1930s, have been criticized by more recent standards for their limited attention to the stratigraphic context of some finds, but the overall quality of the documentation and the scholarly analysis was high by the standards of the period. The Iranian Archaeological Service conducted its own investigations at the site from the 1940s onward, and the collaboration and occasional tension between the Oriental Institute's work and the Iranian archaeological authorities reflects the broader dynamics of the field of Near Eastern archaeology in the post-colonial period, in which Western scholarly institutions and the governments of the countries in which ancient sites were located were working out new frameworks for the management of archaeological heritage. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 brought a significant change in the political context of archaeological work at Persepolis, and the subsequent decades have seen both significant new discoveries by Iranian archaeologists and significant difficulties in the international scholarly access that would allow the full integration of the site's evidence into the broader scholarship of the ancient world. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979, an irony of timing that placed the recognition of its global significance at exactly the moment when the political context in which it existed underwent its most dramatic transformation. The management of Persepolis in the contemporary period reflects the broader tensions of the site's position as the most important pre-Islamic monument in Iran, simultaneously a source of national pride for a civilization that predates Islam by more than a millennium and a source of ideological ambivalence for a government whose official ideology centers on Islamic identity. The modern Iranian scholarly tradition of Persepolis studies has produced significant new discoveries and interpretations over the past 4 decades of work by Iranian archaeologists and historians, a dimension of the site's scholarship that has been underrepresented in the international academic literature primarily because of the political and logistical barriers to scholarly exchange that the post-revolutionary period created. The integration of the Iranian scholarly contribution with the established international scholarship is one of the major challenges and most promising potential developments for the field. The specific discoveries made by Iranian excavations at the lower city level have added important dimensions to the understanding of how Persepolis functioned as a living community rather than simply as a ceremonial monument. The remains of storage facilities, workshops, and residential quarters found in the lower city areas give a more grounded picture of the social reality behind the monumental architecture of the terrace and the specific material culture of daily life at Persepolis, including everyday pottery, tools, and personal ornaments, provides a counterpart to the royal art of the terrace that is essential for a complete understanding of the site. Persepolis was not only the ceremonial stage for the projection of imperial power, but also the home of the thousands of people who made that ceremonial activity possible. The integration of the Iranian scholarly contribution with the established international scholarship is one of the major challenges and most promising potential developments for the field, and it would produce a significantly more complete understanding of the site than either tradition alone can achieve. The specific political situation of the Persepolis fortification archive, with approximately 30,000 clay tablets held in Chicago as the property of the Iranian government under a complex and contested legal arrangement, is one of the more poignant examples of the way in which the politics of the modern world have affected the scholarship of the ancient one. The tablets document the daily administrative operations of the greatest empire of the ancient world, and they have been the subject of extraordinary scholarly work by teams at the Oriental Institute. Their return to Iran, which would unite them with related material held in Tehran and allow Iranian scholars to work with the full corpus in their own country, is a goal that both scholarly communities acknowledge as desirable, but that the specific political and legal circumstances of the relationship between the United States and Iran have made impossible to achieve. The specific ways in which the political situation of Iran has affected the scholarly access to Persepolis since the Revolution of 1979 have produced genuine gaps in the international understanding of the site that could be addressed by a normalization of the scholarly exchange relationships between Iranian and international institutions. The Persepolis Fortification Archive remains in Chicago, the subject of ongoing legal and political negotiation, while the tablets found in the treasury of Persepolis are in Tehran. The integration of these two related bodies of evidence, which together constitute the documentary record of the Achaemenid administration of the imperial heartland, would be enormously productive for the scholarly understanding of the period. And the specific practical and political barriers to that integration are among the more regrettable consequences of the political estrangement between Iran and the Western scholarly world in the post-revolutionary period. The management of Persepolis as a heritage site in the contemporary period faces challenges that go beyond the standard conservation issues of any ancient monument. The political tension between the site's importance as a symbol of pre-Islamic Persian identity and the Islamic identity of the Iranian state creates a specific ideological context for heritage management that has no parallel at most other major ancient sites. The development of an interpretation of Persepolis that presents the site's significance in terms that are acceptable within the official ideology of the Islamic Republic, while also communicating the genuine historical and cultural importance of the Achaemenid achievement to visitors who come from diverse cultural and political backgrounds, is one of the ongoing challenges of the site's management. And the specific ways in which the site's presentation has evolved over the decades since the Revolution reflect the specific political negotiations that this challenge has required. The specific discoveries made by Iranian excavations at the lower city level, the area below the monumental terrace where the residential and administrative buildings of the working population of the complex were located, have added important dimensions to the understanding of how Persepolis functioned as a living community rather than simply as a ceremonial monument. The experience of being at Persepolis, walking through the ruins of the greatest ceremonial complex of the ancient world, is one that the specific qualities of the site, its scale, its state of preservation, and the specific character of the landscape in which it is set, make distinctive among the major archaeological sites of the ancient Near East. The approach to the site from the modern road gives the visitor a first impression of the terrace rising above the surrounding plain that conveys something of what the ancient approach must have felt like, the monumentality of the artificial platform making itself felt before any of the specific architectural elements are visible. The ascent of the double staircase, with its shallow treads designed for the easy mounting of tribute delegations, is the same physical experience that the delegates of 23 peoples made in the spring ceremonies of the Achaemenid New Year, though the king's presence at the top of the stair is now the gate of all nations rather than the living monarch awaiting his tribute. The Gate of All Nations, built by Xerxes, still has its doorways standing, flanked by the monumental bull figures whose scale is intended to dwarf the human beings who pass between them. The specifically political message of the gate's iconography, in which the visitor passes between the symbols of royal power before entering the king's ceremonial space, has been commented on by every scholar who has studied the site's architecture, and the experience of passing through the gate still communicates something of its original effect even without the context of imperial ceremony that gave it its full meaning. The standing columns of the Apadana, the most immediately striking feature of the site, give the ruins a quality of forest-like verticality that no other ancient site quite replicates. Standing in the space of the Apadana and looking up at the surviving columns, imagining the 72 columns that once stood here and the roof they supported, imagining the thousands of people who filled this space at the height of the Nowruz ceremonies, and then imagining the fire that burned through this space in a single night and brought the roof down in a cascade of fire and collapsed masonry, produces a specific quality of historical consciousness that the site's physical character uniquely enables. The burned roof timbers of the Apadana and the other major buildings were found in the excavations as carbonized beams distributed across the floor levels of the buildings, and the pattern of their distribution provided evidence not only for the architectural character of the roof structures but for the specific sequence of events during the fire. The collapse of the roof was not simultaneous across the building but proceeded section by section as the supporting timbers burned through at different rates, and the distribution of the collapsed materials reflects this sequential process. Reading this pattern in the excavation records is reading the physical signature of the fire in the archaeological evidence, one of the more uncanny experiences available in the study of this extraordinarily documented site. The specific preservation conditions at Persepolis, which include the extreme aridity of the Fars Plateau in summer, the relative protection from disturbance that the site's remoteness provided before the modern road, and the specific character of the destruction, which collapsed buildings around the objects they contained rather than dispersing them, have produced an archaeological record whose density and completeness are exceptional for a site of this period and scale. The specific finds from the excavation of the treasury, which included a large number of clay ceilings from the administrative operations of the building alongside the luxury objects that the treasury stored, provide a picture of the administrative practices of the Achaemenid court that would not be recoverable from any other type of evidence. The specific finds from the burned levels of the Apadana and the other major buildings, including the carbonized remains of cedar timbers from Lebanon that had been imported for the roof construction, the residues of organic materials burned in the fire, and the traces of pigment from the painted surfaces of the stone, provide a remarkably detailed picture of the material character of the building before the fire. The use of cedar for the major roof timbers was itself a statement of imperial power. Lebanese cedar was one of the most expensive building materials in the ancient Near East, requiring the organization of a supply chain from the forests of the Lebanese mountains to the plateau of Fars, a distance of more than 1,500 kilometers. The specific choice of this material for the roofs of Persepolis was both a practical decision, since cedar is one of the most durable and the most fragrant of the available timbers, and a political one, demonstrating the empire's ability to mobilize resources from its most distant provinces for the adornment of its ceremonial capital. The reliefs of Persepolis are among the most extensively studied monuments of the ancient world, and the specific questions that scholars have brought to them over the past century and a half of serious scholarship reflect the changing theoretical frameworks of the discipline and the specific possibilities that new analytical methods have opened up. The initial European scholarly response to the Persepolis reliefs was focused primarily on their identification and description, on answering the basic questions of who was depicted and what they were doing. The identification of the tribute-bearing peoples with specific geographic and ethnic groups required the cross-referencing of the carved images with the texts of the royal inscriptions and with the descriptions of the various peoples of the empire preserved in the Greek historians, a process that produced the standard identification of the 23 delegations that remains the basis of all subsequent discussion. This identification was not straightforward, and some delegations remained disputed, reflecting the genuine difficulty of mapping the carved images onto the heterogeneous sources. The subsequent generation of scholarship moved beyond identification to the interpretation of the iconographic program as a whole, asking what the specific arrangement of the reliefs was designed to communicate and how that communication functioned within the specific ritual context of the Nowruz ceremony. The interpretation of the reliefs as a statement of the imperial ideology of the Achaemenid dynasty, rather than simply as decoration, was developed by scholars working in the later 20th century, who brought the analytical frameworks of art history and political theory to the monuments and who produced readings of the iconographic program that treat it as a deliberately constructed political text. More recent scholarship has applied the specific analytical tools of the digital revolution to the reliefs, using photogrammetric survey and three-dimensional modeling to document the physical state of the monuments with a precision that previous methods could not achieve and to identify details and relationships that the human eye alone misses. The development of standardized digital documentation of the relief sculptures has also facilitated comparative study across the different relief programs of the site and across the broader corpus of Achaemenid art, revealing patterns and variations that were not previously visible. The conservation of the reliefs, which are carved in limestone that is vulnerable to the specific combination of air pollution, salt crystallization, biological growth, and visitor impact that threatens the monument in its current condition, is one of the most urgent practical challenges facing the site. The development of appropriate conservation treatments for limestone in the specific climate of the Fars Plateau, which combines dry hot summers with cold winters and occasional rain events, has been one of the active research programs of the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization and its international partners. The relationship between the modern visitor's experience of Persepolis and the ancient visitor's experience is one of the more interesting comparative questions that the site raises. The ancient visitor approached through a ceremonially organized space, processed through the gate of all nations, and experienced the Apadana as a building full of people and activity in the context of the Nowruz ceremony. The modern visitor approaches through a parking lot and a visitor center, processes through a single modern entrance, and experiences the Apadana as a forest of isolated columns in a space that is defined by absence rather than presence. Both experiences are genuine experiences of the site, but they are radically different experiences, and the modern experience is shaped as much by the fire of 330 BCE and the 2.5 millennia of subsequent history as by the intentions of the Achaemenid architects who designed the space. The specific challenge of interpreting Persepolis for modern visitors, who come from cultural contexts entirely different from those of the ancient world and who bring to the site expectations and frameworks formed by museum experiences, heritage tourism, and popular culture representations of ancient Persia that range from the scholarly to the fantastical, is one that the site's modern managers have addressed with varying degrees of success. The on-site museum provides an introduction to the Achaemenid world that helps visitors unfamiliar with the period to make sense of what they are seeing, but the specific experience of standing among the ruins, of touching the carved stone, of looking out from the terrace across the plain of Fars to the mountains beyond, is one that no amount of contextual information can fully prepare a visitor for, and that the site delivers with a directness and a power that no reproduction can replicate. The question of what Persepolis meant to the Persian people themselves, and what it means today to the Iranian nation that is its heir, is one that has no simple answer and that touches on some of the most contested questions of Iranian cultural and political identity in the modern period. The Achaemenid Empire and its monuments represent a point of connection to a pre-Islamic Iranian past that extends back more than 2,500 years, and the relationship between this ancient heritage and the Islamic identity that has defined Iranian civilization since the Arab conquest of the 7th century has been a source of ongoing tension and negotiation in Iranian cultural history. The Shahnameh, the great Persian epic poem of Ferdowsi written in the 11th century, celebrates the pre-Islamic Persian past in terms that make it a foundational text of Iranian national identity while simultaneously condemning the Arab conquest as a catastrophe. The tension between these two dimensions of Iranian identity, the pre-Islamic Persian heritage and the Islamic tradition, runs through Iranian cultural history and manifests in specific ways in the relationship between modern Iran and the monuments of the Achaemenid period. The Pahlavi dynasty that ruled Iran from 1925 to 1979 made the pre-Islamic Persian heritage a central element of its national ideology, using the Achaemenid monuments as symbols of Iranian national greatness and staging in 1971 an elaborate celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire at Persepolis itself, an event that brought heads of state from across the world to the ruins of the ancient ceremonial capital, and that was simultaneously one of the most spectacular cultural events of the 20th century and one of the most politically controversial, given the excesses of the ceremony and the disparities between its cost and the poverty of much of Iran's population. The Islamic Republic that replaced the Pahlavi dynasty after the revolution of 1979 initially adopted a posture of official indifference or hostility toward the pre-Islamic heritage, with some revolutionary figures calling for the destruction of the Achaemenid monuments as symbols of the rejected monarchical past. The monuments were not destroyed, and the more pragmatic attitude that eventually prevailed recognized both the economic value of the pre-Islamic heritage as a tourist resource and the depth of the popular attachment to the pre-Islamic past that made any serious attempt at its suppression politically unworkable. The current situation is one in which the pre-Islamic monuments are officially recognized as part of the national heritage of Iran and are managed by the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization, but in which the specific ideological valence of that heritage remains contested and the relationship between the ancient Persian past and the Islamic present continues to be negotiated. The tourist who visits Persepolis today encounters a site that is managed for visitors and that has the basic infrastructure of a major heritage site: an on-site museum, explanatory signage, guided tour services. But the experience of the site, even in its managed modern form, retains something of the specific quality that has drawn travelers to it since the first European visitors in the 16th century. The scale of the ruins, the precision of the surviving carvings, the specific quality of the light on the stone in the late afternoon, and the overwhelming sense of temporal distance that the contemplation of something so ancient and so deliberately crafted produces. The guides who lead tours through Persepolis today are performing a function that has no ancient parallel and yet that serves a genuine human need: the need to be present in the company of something larger than oneself, to feel the weight of human time through the evidence of human ambition that has outlasted the ambition itself. The modern Iranian scholarly tradition of Persepolis studies, which has produced significant new discoveries and interpretations over the past 4 decades of work by Iranian archaeologists and historians, is a dimension of the site's scholarship that has been underrepresented in the international academic literature primarily because of the political and logistical barriers to scholarly exchange that the post-revolutionary period created. The integration of the Iranian scholarly contribution with the established international scholarship is one of the major challenges and one of the most promising potential developments for the field, and it would produce a significantly more complete understanding of the site than either tradition alone can achieve. The specific buildings of the Persepolis Terrace, each constructed at specific moments during the 200-year history of the complex, tell a story of the evolving priorities and the changing circumstances of the Achaemenid dynasty that is recoverable from the architectural evidence even in the absence of detailed historical documentation. Darius the Great, the founder of Persepolis, initiated the construction of the terrace and the first major buildings in the last decade of the 6th century BCE. His building program focused on the essential functional elements of the ceremonial complex: the Apadana, the great audience hall whose massive scale would dominate the site for the remainder of its history, and the palace of Darius himself, the Takara, whose relatively intimate scale reflects the specific character of the building as the king's personal space within the larger ceremonial complex. The Takara is the best preserved of the royal palaces at Persepolis, its carved door frames and window frames still showing the polished stone surfaces that the Achaemenid craftsmen achieved, and its inscriptions providing some of the most extensive royal texts at the site. Xerxes, Darius's son and successor, continued and expanded the construction program initiated by his father, completing the Apadana, constructing the Gate of All Nations at the main entrance to the terrace, and adding his own palace, the Hadish, whose position on the highest point of the terrace commands views across the entire complex and the surrounding plain. The Hadish inscription, in which Xerxes declares the same principles of truth and righteousness that his father had proclaimed, is one of the most extensive royal texts at the site and provides the clearest statement of the specific political theology of the Achaemenid imperial project. Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' successor, constructed the throne hall or Hall of 100 Columns, whose greater size than the Apadana reflects the continued expansion of the ceremonial requirements of the empire in the mid-5th century. The Hall of 100 Columns was the most recent of the major buildings on the terrace and the one whose construction was still ongoing when Alexander burned the complex in 330 BCE, though it was substantially complete. The specific architectural evolution from the Apadana to the Hall of 100 Columns reflects changes in both the scale of the ceremonial requirements of the Achaemenid court and in the specific architectural conventions through which those requirements were expressed. The doorjambs and window frames of the royal palaces at Persepolis, which survive in many cases to nearly their full height while the walls that contain them have collapsed, provide some of the finest examples of the Achaemenid stone carving tradition. The figures carved on the doorjambs of the Takara, the palace of Darius, show the king himself in his ceremonial costume, flanked by attendants who hold sunshades and fly whisks, and by servants carrying the symbols of royal authority. The specific posture and costume of the king figure, which appears in recognizably similar form on doorjambs throughout the complex, is one of the most standardized elements of the Persepolis iconographic program and one of the most immediately recognizable symbols of Achaemenid royal identity. The royal tombs at Naksh-e-Rostam, approximately 5 kilometers from Persepolis, are closely associated with the ceremonial complex, though physically separate from the terrace. 4 Achaemenid kings, Darius I, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, and Darius II, have their tombs carved into the rock face of the Naksh-e-Rostam cliff, each tomb taking the form of a cross-shaped facade with a false door at the center flanked by registers of relief carving showing the king before an altar and supported by the representatives of the subject peoples of the empire. The tombs extend the iconographic program of Persepolis into the funerary domain, presenting the king's authority as extending beyond death into a divine realm from which his subjects continue to receive his protection. The relationship between the royal tombs at Naksh-e-Rostam and the ceremonial complex of Persepolis is one that the Achaemenid architects clearly intended to be visible and meaningful. The tombs are positioned on the cliff face so that they are visible from the road approaching Persepolis, and the walk or drive from the tombs to the terrace passes through the landscape that both monuments were designed to consecrate as the sacred heartland of Achaemenid royal power. The specific iconographic programs of the tomb facades, which show the king above an altar supported by representatives of the subject peoples of the empire, extend the visual argument of the Apadana reliefs into the funerary domain, asserting that the king's authority over the peoples of the empire continues after death, and that the order he maintained in life is guaranteed by divine approval that transcends the mortality of the individual king. Persepolis stands in its ruins on the plateau of Fars, its remaining columns visible from miles away in the clear air of the Iranian highland, its carved reliefs still legible in the specific flat profile style that the Achaemenid craftsmen developed over 2 centuries of refinement, its burned stones still showing the discoloration that the fire of 330 BCE produced in a single night. The fire that destroyed the palaces was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the Achaemenid Empire's ability to sustain the ceremonial tradition that Persepolis had been built to express. Without the king, without the tribute system, without the administrative apparatus that brought 23 people's representatives to the Noras each spring, the terrace was just stone and burned wood, its elaborate architecture a stage without actors and its iconographic program a statement without an audience. But the fire also began the long process of transformation by which Persepolis became what it is today, a ruin whose specific character, the burned stones, the collapsed roofs, the fallen columns, the looted treasury, records the specific violence of its ending in a way that a site that simply declined and was abandoned over time would not. The reliefs that survive on the staircases of the Apadana survived because they were below ground level when the fire burned, protected from the worst of the heat by the accumulated debris of the burned superstructure that fell around them. The specific process of their survival is one of the more poignant ironies of the site. The destruction of the buildings above them preserved the message that the buildings were built to project, the procession of tribute bearers from 23 peoples, the guards of the king, the symbols of an imperial order that no longer existed when the carved procession became visible again to the 19th century scholars who cleared the debris from the staircases. The peoples depicted in the procession, the Lydians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Indians and the Ethiopians, continued to exist after the empire that organized their tribute into a visual program ceased to exist. Their descendants live in the same regions today, separated from the carved figures on the staircase by 2,500 years of history, but connected to them by the continuity of human habitation in the specific landscapes that the Achaemenid geographers knew by their specific names. The empire is gone. The peoples remain. The columns that still stand at Persepolis are among the most eloquent monuments of the ancient world. They stand not as the triumph of the civilization that built them, but as evidence of the specific quality of human ambition that drives the construction of things designed to last forever, and of the specific quality of human destructiveness that can reduce in a single night what took 2 centuries to build. Both qualities are present at Persepolis in their most extreme forms, and the coexistence of the two, the extraordinary beauty of the surviving architecture and the comprehensive destruction of the fire, is what gives the site its specific emotional and historical character. Standing among the columns of the Apadana in the late afternoon, when the light turns the stone to gold and the shadows of the columns fall across the reliefs of the tribute-bearers, it is possible to feel both the grandeur of what was built here and the enormity of what was lost, simultaneously and with equal force. The tribute-bearers in the relief procession have been walking toward the king for 2,500 years, and they will continue walking for as long as the stone holds. The king they are walking toward is not there and has not been there since 330 BCE. But the procession does not stop. The Lydians with their metal vessels, the Ethiopians with their elephant tusks, the Indians with their gold, the delegations from the farthest reaches of the ancient world. They continue their approach in the flat profile style of Achaemenid art, patient and precise. As the sun moves across the Fars plateau and the shadows lengthen and the few visitors who have made the journey from Shiraz sit on the steps of the Apadana and watch the light change on the stone. Persepolis ended in a fire, but the procession it carved is forever. The tribute-bearers of 25 centuries ago will still be walking toward their king long after we who watch them tonight have passed into the same silence that descended on the Achaemenid world when Alexander's torches did their work. The fire was one night. The stone is a different kind of time entirely. And in that contrast between the brevity of the fire and the permanence of the stone, Persepolis communicates something essential about the specific fragility and the specific durability of what human beings make when they build at the limit of their capacity. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.